The bookstore buzzed with anticipation as Marcus Reed adjusted his navy blazer and flashed that practiced smile that had graced a dozen magazine covers. 300 eager readers packed every available space, clutching pristine copies of his latest bestseller, Shadows of Tomorrow. The line snaked around the fiction section, past the coffee bar, and out onto the sidewalk where devoted fans waited in the October chill. Behind the signing table, Sarah Reed organized the towering stacks of books with quiet efficiency. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same understated black dress she had chosen for every one of Marcus's events over the past 8 years. No one in the crowd paid her any attention. She was simply part of the backdrop, like the promotional banners and the carefully arranged display of Marcus's entire catalog. A young woman approached the table, her copy already open to the title page. She gushed about the complex themes woven throughout the narrative, specifically praising the intricate subplot involving the protagonist's relationship with his estranged daughter. Marcus nodded graciously, his pen hovering over the page as he prepared his standard inscription. But then the fan asked about the historical research behind the 1920s setting, referencing specific details about Prohibition-era Chicago that had made the story feel so authentic. Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment. His eyes darted toward Sarah, who was quietly straightening the book display. Without missing a beat, Sarah leaned forward and provided a detailed explanation about the speakeasy locations, the political corruption networks, and the social dynamics that had shaped that particular neighborhood during that era. The fan listened with rapt attention, clearly impressed by the depth of knowledge. As the conversation concluded, Marcus quickly signed the book and handed it back with a dismissive wave toward Sarah. "Oh, she just helps with the research," he said with a casual laugh. "You know how it is. Writers need someone to handle all the mundane details while we focus on the real creative work." The fan nodded politely, though her expression suggested she had been more impressed by Sarah's insights than Marcus's signature. "I wonder where you're all watching this story unfold from tonight. Whether you're in a cozy reading nook in Maine or listening during your evening commute in California, I bet many of you have witnessed moments like this where someone's contributions get dismissed right in front of your eyes. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from, because this story about hidden talent and stolen credit is unfortunately universal." The evening continued with a steady stream of admirers. A retired English teacher asked about Marcus's writing process, particularly his ability to create such believable female characters. Marcus launched into his rehearsed explanation about the importance of observation and empathy in crafting authentic voices. He spoke about studying people in coffee shops and drawing inspiration from overheard conversations. Sarah continued her quiet work, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to him describe techniques she had taught him during their early years together. When a literature student questioned Marcus about the evolution of his narrative style across his 7 published novels, pointing out the remarkable consistency in voice despite the varied subject matter, Marcus preened under the praise. He spoke about finding his authentic voice and maintaining artistic integrity throughout his career. What he didn't mention was that Sarah had spent countless hours analyzing and refining that voice, ensuring that each manuscript maintained the same rhythm, the same careful balance of introspection and action that had become his trademark. The signing concluded near 10 o'clock, and the bookstore staff began the process of cleaning up. Marcus basked in the lingering praise from the store manager, who gushed about the turnout and the enthusiastic response from readers. Sarah packed up the remaining books and gathered the promotional materials, her movements efficient and practiced. She had performed this same routine in dozens of cities across the country. During the drive home to their suburban Connecticut house, Marcus replayed the evening's highlights, particularly savoring the moment when the literature student had compared his work to established masters of contemporary fiction. Sarah drove in silence, her hands steady on the steering wheel as Marcus's voice filled the car with his analysis of which comments had been most insightful and which readers had truly understood his artistic vision. Their home reflected Marcus's success in every carefully chosen detail. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves displayed not only his published works, but also the foreign translations, book club editions, and special anniversary releases. Awards and framed reviews adorned the walls of his study, creating a shrine to his literary achievements. Sarah's contribution to this success remained invisible, hidden away in the locked bottom drawer of her desk in the small home office they officially called the research room. That night, after Marcus had retired to their bedroom with a satisfied smile and a glass of expensive whiskey, Sarah sat alone in the research room. She unlocked the bottom drawer and retrieved a manila folder thick with handwritten pages. The folder contained the complete first draft of Marcus's next novel, written entirely in Sarah's neat handwriting. Every plot point, every character development, every piece of dialogue had flowed from her imagination onto these pages. She had been working on this particular story for 8 months, crafting it during the quiet morning hours before Marcus woke and during the evenings when he was occupied with interviews or social obligations. The narrative explored themes of identity and authenticity, ironically enough, telling the story of a woman who discovers her own strength after years of living in someone else's shadow. Sarah closed the folder and returned it to its hiding place. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of typing the manuscript on Marcus's computer, formatting it according to his publisher's specifications. Within a few weeks, Marcus would present it to his editor as his latest creative breakthrough, and the cycle would continue as it had for nearly a decade. The house settled into silence around her as she turned off the desk lamp and headed upstairs. In a few hours, Marcus would wake and begin his daily routine of checking reviews, responding to fan mail, and planning his next promotional appearance. He would spend the day inhabiting the role of celebrated author while Sarah remained in the background, invisible and essential, the true creative force behind the fiction that bore his name. 3 months after that book signing, Sarah returned home early from her weekly grocery run to find Marcus's car in the driveway alongside an unfamiliar red Honda Civic. She carried the bags through the front door, expecting to find Marcus meeting with his editor or perhaps entertaining a visiting journalist. Instead, she discovered him on their living room sofa with a young woman who couldn't have been older than 25. The woman had long blonde hair and wore a Columbia Journalism School sweatshirt. Empty wine glasses sat on the coffee table between scattered manuscript pages, and the intimate way Marcus's hand rested on the woman's shoulder made the situation immediately clear. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, grocery bags still clutched in her hands, as Marcus looked up with an expression more annoyed than guilty. The young woman, who introduced herself as Chloe Brennan, scrambled to gather her things while Marcus remained seated with infuriating casualness. Chloe mumbled something about conducting an interview for her graduate thesis on contemporary literary voices before fleeing through the front door. Marcus watched her leave, then turned to face Sarah with the same dismissive expression he had perfected for dealing with overeager fans. Sarah set down the groceries with deliberate precision. Her voice remained steady as she asked how long this had been going on. Marcus shrugged, pouring himself another glass of wine as if they were discussing weekend plans. He explained that Chloe was brilliant, genuinely interested in literature, and refreshingly free of the mundane concerns that seemed to occupy most people's attention. Unlike some people, he added pointedly, she actually appreciated the artistic process. The confrontation that followed revealed 8 years of accumulated resentment. Marcus accused Sarah of stifling his creativity through her constant need for acknowledgement. He described her as fortunate to be associated with real talent, suggesting that her minor contributions to his research hardly warranted the comfortable lifestyle she enjoyed. When Sarah mentioned the countless hours she spent crafting his narratives, Marcus laughed with genuine derision. He told her that organizing notes and handling correspondence didn't make someone a writer any more than tuning a piano made someone a composer. Sarah moved into the guest bedroom that night. Marcus continued his affair openly, bringing Chloe to literary events and introducing her as a promising young journalist who truly understood his work. The situation became unbearable when Marcus announced that he and Chloe were collaborating on a collection of essays about the intersection of journalism and fiction. The irony of his enthusiasm for this collaboration, after years of dismissing Sarah's contributions, crystallized her decision to file for divorce. The divorce attorney's office felt like a medical facility, all chrome fixtures and sterile lighting that seemed designed to strip emotion from even the most personal discussions. Marcus arrived with his lawyer, Jonathan Reeves, a sharp-featured man who specialized in protecting the assets of high-profile clients. Sarah sat across the mahogany conference table with her own attorney, Patricia Vance, a no-nonsense woman recommended by Sarah's sister. Marcus wasted no time establishing his position. He insisted that his literary career represented his sole creative output and demanded that any settlement protect his future earning potential. According to Marcus, Sarah's role had been purely supportive, comparable to an administrative assistant who happened to live in the same house. He wanted full ownership of all existing copyrights, future royalties, and any derivative rights for film or television adaptations. Jonathan Reeves outlined their demands with clinical precision. Marcus would retain the family home, his study with all its awards and memorabilia, and complete control over his publishing relationships. Sarah could keep her personal belongings and receive a modest monthly allowance, but any claim to his literary earnings would end with the divorce. They characterized this as more than generous, considering that Sarah had never held a traditional job during their marriage. Patricia Vance listened to these demands with raised eyebrows. She asked pointed questions about Sarah's involvement in the creative process, specifically requesting details about research, editing, and manuscript development. Marcus's responses grew increasingly defensive as he insisted that inspiration and execution were entirely separate processes. He claimed that while Sarah might have helped gather background information, the actual writing required artistic vision that only he possessed. The tension in the room escalated when Patricia asked Marcus to describe his typical writing routine. He spoke about his morning ritual of coffee and meditation, his afternoon writing sessions, and his evening review process. But when she asked about specific technical aspects like manuscript formatting, submission protocols, and editorial communication, Marcus became evasive. He suggested that such details were beneath a serious writer's attention and better handled by support staff. Sarah sat silently through most of this discussion, taking careful notes while Marcus painted himself as the sole creative force behind 8 successful novels. She watched him describe writing sessions that had never happened and claimed credit for research techniques she had developed over years of collaboration. His confidence in these lies was almost admirable in its completeness. After the meeting, Marcus's behavior shifted from dismissive to actively hostile. He changed the passwords on all their shared accounts, including the bank accounts that contained royalty payments and the email addresses connected to his publishing contracts. When Sarah tried to access the home computer to retrieve her personal files, she discovered that he had removed her user account entirely. Marcus also contacted his publisher, Hartwell Literary Press, to express concerns about how the divorce might affect his productivity. He spoke with his editor, Robert Chun, about protecting his creative process from potential disruptions. According to Marcus, Sarah might attempt to claim unwarranted credit for his work as part of the divorce proceedings, and he wanted the publisher to understand that any such claims were completely unfounded. Robert Chun assured Marcus that Hartwell would support their most successful author through this difficult personal period. However, privately, Chun felt uneasy about the conversation. In his 12 years of working with Marcus, he had noticed that all communication about manuscripts, deadlines, and editorial revisions came through Sarah. She was the one who submitted the polished drafts, responded to editorial suggestions, and managed the complex logistics of publication schedules. Sarah began quietly gathering documentation from the years of their marriage. She retrieved old computer backup drives from storage, collected printed emails, and organized the extensive research files she had maintained for each of Marcus's novels. Her sister helped her scan and digitize handwritten notes, creating multiple copies of everything that might prove relevant to establishing her contributions to Marcus's success. The most damaging evidence came from Marcus's own carelessness. In his rush to eliminate Sarah's access to their shared accounts, he had overlooked several old email chains where he explicitly acknowledged her role in developing plot points and character arcs. There were messages to his agent praising Sarah's insights, and others to his editor crediting her with solving narrative problems that had stalled his progress. Marcus's public statements during this period revealed his growing desperation to control the narrative surrounding their divorce. He gave an interview to Publishers Weekly describing the challenges of maintaining artistic focus during personal upheaval. He spoke about the importance of protecting creative work from external interference and hinted that some people might attempt to claim credit they hadn't earned. The literary community interpreted these comments as standard divorce positioning, unaware of the deeper truth they concealed. As the legal proceedings intensified, Marcus became increasingly possessive of what he viewed as his literary empire. He treated each book, each award, each positive review as personal property that Sarah threatened to steal. His sense of ownership extended beyond the financial aspects of his success to encompass the very identity he had built as a celebrated author. Sarah's transformation during this period was subtle but significant. Years of self-doubt and imposed invisibility began giving way to quiet determination. She stopped apologizing for taking up space and started documenting her contributions with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made Marcus's novels so successful. The woman who had hidden her manuscripts in locked drawers was preparing to step into the light, armed with evidence that would soon shatter the illusion Marcus had spent nearly a decade constructing. The Fairfield County Courthouse buzzed with quiet anticipation as the divorce proceedings entered their third week. Judge Margaret Thornton presided over the oak-paneled courtroom with the measured authority of someone who had spent 25 years untangling the complex financial disputes that accompanied high-profile divorces. Today's session would focus specifically on the intellectual property claims that had transformed a straightforward marital dissolution into something far more intriguing. Marcus Reed sat at the plaintiff's table wearing his most expensive charcoal suit, his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to public attention. His lawyer, Jonathan Reeves, had arranged a stack of Marcus's published novels on the table like evidence of his undisputed creative genius. Marcus occasionally glanced toward the gallery, where several literary journalists had gathered to observe what Publishers Weekly had already dubbed the most fascinating literary divorce in recent memory. Sarah sat beside Patricia Vance at the defendant's table, her appearance deliberately understated in a navy business suit that projected competence without drawing attention. Unlike Marcus, she avoided eye contact with the observers, focusing instead on the legal pad where she had outlined key points for her attorney's reference. The transformation from invisible helpmate to legal adversary had required months of preparation, and today would test whether her evidence could withstand Marcus's confident assertions. Marcus took the witness stand first, his testimony polished and persuasive. He described his writing process with the practiced ease of someone who had given countless interviews on the subject. He spoke about the solitary nature of creative work, the importance of maintaining artistic focus, and the years of dedication required to develop a distinctive literary voice. When Jonathan Reeves asked him to describe his wife's role in his career, Marcus's response was both generous and dismissive. According to his testimony, Sarah had been invaluable as a research assistant and general support system. She handled the mundane aspects of his career that would otherwise distract him from the creative process. This included organizing his schedule, managing correspondence with fans, and occasionally helping gather background information for his novels. However, Marcus emphasized, the actual writing had always been his exclusive domain. Every plot development, every character insight, every stylistic choice had originated from his imagination and been executed through his unique artistic vision. Judge Thornton listened to this testimony with professional neutrality, taking detailed notes as Marcus painted himself as the sole creative force behind 8 best-selling novels. His confidence never wavered as he described writing sessions that began before dawn and continued late into the evening. He spoke about the physical act of writing, the satisfaction of watching blank pages transform into compelling narratives, and the personal investment required to breathe life into fictional characters. The atmosphere shifted when Patricia Vance called Robert Chun to the witness stand. Chun had published Marcus's work for 7 years through Hartwell Literary Press, and his professional relationship with the author made him a crucial witness in determining the true nature of the creative process. Chun's discomfort was evident as he took his oath, his usual publisher's confidence replaced by visible nervousness. Patricia began with routine questions about Chun's professional background and his relationship with Marcus as an author. Chun described Marcus as one of Hartwell's most successful writers, praising his consistent productivity and the commercial appeal of his work. However, when Patricia asked Chun to describe his typical interactions with Marcus during the manuscript development process, The publisher's responses became increasingly cautious. Chen explained that most of his communication regarding manuscripts, deadlines, and editorial revisions had been conducted through email and phone conversations. When Patricia asked whether Marcus typically submitted handwritten drafts or typed manuscripts, Chen paused for an uncomfortably long moment before answering that he had never seen any handwritten materials from Marcus. All submissions had arrived as polished digital documents, formatted according to industry standards. The questioning became more pointed when Patricia asked Chen to describe Marcus's response to editorial suggestions. Chen admitted that he rarely spoke directly with Marcus about specific revisions or structural changes. Instead, these discussions typically involved Sarah, who demonstrated a remarkably detailed understanding of the narrative choices and thematic elements in each manuscript. Chen had assumed this arrangement reflected Marcus's preference for having his wife handle business communications while he focused on creative work. Jonathan Reeves objected to this line of questioning, arguing that communication preferences had no bearing on authorship. Judge Thornton overruled the objection, noting that the court needed to understand the practical aspects of the creative and editorial process. She encouraged Patricia to continue exploring the publisher's direct observations about how Marcus's books were actually produced. Chen's testimony grew increasingly uncomfortable as Patricia pressed for specific details about editorial meetings and revision discussions. The publisher admitted that Sarah had been present at every significant editorial conference, often providing detailed explanations for character motivations and plot developments that Marcus seemed unable to articulate with the same precision. Chen had noticed this pattern but had attributed it to the collaborative nature of their marriage rather than questioning the fundamental authorship claims. When Patricia asked Chen whether Marcus had ever demonstrated the kind of intimate knowledge of his own work that publishers typically expected from authors, Chen's silence stretched long enough to create palpable tension in the courtroom. Finally, he admitted that Marcus often deferred to Sarah when editors raised technical questions about narrative structure or thematic consistency. This had struck Chen as unusual but not necessarily suspicious, given that some authors preferred to avoid the business aspects of publishing. The most damaging portion of Chen's testimony came when Patricia introduced email evidence from Hartwell's internal correspondence. Several messages between Chen and his editorial staff specifically praised the sophistication of Marcus's narrative techniques and his responsiveness to editorial feedback. However, when Chen was shown the metadata from these email exchanges, it became clear that all the praised responses had originated from Sarah's email address, not Marcus's. Chen's face flushed as he examined the digital evidence. He admitted that he had never questioned the source of these communications, assuming that Marcus and Sarah shared email accounts as many married couples do. However, the pattern of exclusive communication through Sarah's accounts raised questions that Chen had never considered during their 7-year professional relationship. Judge Thornton observed this testimony with growing interest. Her experience with intellectual property disputes had taught her to pay attention to the practical details that often revealed more than confident assertions. The disconnect between Marcus's claimed writing process and the publisher's actual experience suggested complexities that warranted deeper investigation. Marcus's confident demeanor began to show cracks as Chen's testimony continued. The publisher's admissions about communication patterns and editorial discussions contradicted several key elements of Marcus's own testimony. When Jonathan Reeves attempted to redirect Chen's testimony toward Marcus's creative accomplishments, the damage had already been done. The questions about the actual mechanics of authorship had been planted, and they would only grow more problematic as additional witnesses took the stand. Chen left the witness stand looking visibly shaken by the implications of his own testimony. As Hartwell's publisher, he had built his reputation on identifying and nurturing literary talent. The possibility that he had been systematically crediting the wrong person for nearly a decade of successful publications threatened not only his professional judgment, but the integrity of his entire catalog. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically by the time court adjourned for the day. What had begun as a straightforward divorce proceeding had evolved into something far more complex, with implications that extended well beyond the distribution of marital assets. The literary world was about to confront uncomfortable questions about authorship, credit, and the invisible labor that often supports public creative success. The next morning brought a different energy to the courtroom as Patricia Vance prepared to present what she had promised would be conclusive digital evidence. Sarah had spent weeks working with a forensic computer analyst to reconstruct 8 years of electronic communications, and the results painted a picture that would fundamentally challenge Marcus's narrative of sole authorship. Patricia began by introducing Detective Lisa Morrison, a digital forensics specialist who had spent 15 years analyzing electronic evidence for both criminal and civil cases. Morrison's calm professionalism provided a stark contrast to the emotional testimony of the previous day as she explained the process of examining metadata, tracking document creation, and analyzing communication patterns across multiple devices and accounts. The first bombshell came when Morrison presented her analysis of manuscript creation data. Every single novel that Marcus had published showed the same pattern in its digital forensics. The original documents had been created on Sarah's personal laptop, with timestamps indicating composition during early morning hours when Marcus was typically still asleep. The files had then been transferred to Marcus's computer, reformatted, and submitted to publishers under his name. Morrison displayed a timeline on the courtroom's projection screen that made this pattern undeniable. The data showed Sarah's computer creating initial manuscript files, followed by weeks of intensive editing and revision work, all documented through automatic backup systems that had preserved every version. Marcus's computer showed no creative activity during these periods, only the final transfer and submission processes that occurred after the writing was complete. Jonathan Reeves attempted to argue that shared computers and file transfers were common in modern marriages, but Morrison's testimony went far deeper than simple document sharing. Her analysis had revealed that Marcus's computer showed no evidence of the intensive creative work typically associated with novel writing. There were no research files, no character development notes, no plot outlines, and no revision drafts. His digital footprint suggested someone who received finished manuscripts rather than someone who created them. The email evidence proved even more damaging to Marcus's claims. Morrison had recovered thousands of messages between Sarah and various publishing contacts, including editors, marketing teams, and foreign rights agents. These communications revealed Sarah discussing plot points, character motivations, and thematic elements with the detailed knowledge of someone intimately familiar with every aspect of the creative process. One particularly devastating email chain showed Sarah corresponding directly with Marcus's British editor about revisions to his fourth novel. The editor had raised concerns about a subplot that felt inconsistent with the main narrative, and Sarah had responded with a detailed explanation of how to restructure those scenes to better serve the overall story arc. The sophistication of her editorial analysis and her ability to propose specific solutions demonstrated expertise that went far beyond research assistance. Marcus's face grew increasingly pale as each piece of digital evidence was presented. His confident posture from the previous day had given way to visible agitation, and he frequently whispered urgent instructions to Jonathan Reeves. The contrast between his current anxiety and his previous self-assurance was not lost on the observers in the gallery, several of whom were taking detailed notes for their publications. Patricia next introduced phone records that showed hundreds of calls between Sarah and Marcus's literary agent over the past 3 years. The call logs revealed extended conversations that typically occurred during business hours when Marcus was supposedly writing. When Morrison cross-referenced these calls with Marcus's claimed writing schedule, it became clear that Sarah was handling substantive discussions about contracts and creative direction while Marcus was allegedly engaged in the solitary creative process. The most damaging evidence came from copyright registration documents that Marcus had filed with the Library of Congress for each of his novels. Morrison's analysis revealed that these documents contained technical errors and inconsistencies that suggested they had been completed by someone unfamiliar with the actual creative process. More significantly, the filing dates showed a pattern of last-minute submissions that contradicted Marcus's claims about his methodical approach to protecting his intellectual property. Morrison explained that genuine authors typically understand copyright law and file registrations promptly after completing their work. Marcus's filings, however, showed a pattern of hurried submissions often prompted by publisher deadlines rather than personal initiative. The applications contained vague descriptions of the creative process and generic language that suggested they had been completed by someone fulfilling a legal obligation rather than protecting personally meaningful creative work. When Patricia asked Morrison to explain the significance of email metadata, the forensics expert provided a technical explanation that made Marcus's situation even more precarious. Every email contains hidden information about when it was created, from which device it was sent, and through which servers it traveled. This metadata had preserved a perfect record of who was actually communicating with publishers, editors, and agents throughout Marcus's supposedly brilliant career. The metadata revealed that Marcus had rarely initiated email communications about his own work. Instead, nearly all substantive correspondence about manuscripts, deadlines, and editorial decisions had originated from Sarah's devices. Even emails that appeared to come from Marcus's account showed routing information indicating they had been composed on Sarah's computer and sent through her internet connection. Morrison's presentation included a particularly revealing series of messages between Sarah and a freelance copy editor who had worked on Marcus's sixth novel. The editor had sent detailed queries about inconsistencies in character names and timeline issues that needed resolution before publication. Sarah had responded within hours with comprehensive solutions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of every aspect of the narrative. The copy editor had thanked her for the quick turnaround and praised her attention to detail. Marcus's attempt to explain these findings grew increasingly desperate. He claimed that he and Sarah had always worked as a team, with Sarah handling the business communications while he focused on the creative aspects. However, this explanation failed to address why Sarah's communications showed such sophisticated understanding of narrative craft and editorial technique. Her messages didn't read like those of an administrative assistant relaying information from the actual author. Instead, they demonstrated the voice of someone making independent creative decisions. The courtroom tension escalated when Patricia introduced evidence from Marcus's social media accounts. Morrison had analyzed years of posts, interviews, and public statements where Marcus discussed his writing process. Cross-referencing these public claims with the digital evidence revealed multiple instances where Marcus had described creative breakthroughs and writing sessions that the computer records proved could not have occurred. In one particularly damaging example, Marcus had given a podcast interview where he described spending an entire weekend rewriting a crucial scene in his fifth novel. He had painted a vivid picture of the creative struggle, the multiple drafts, and the eventual breakthrough that solved a major plot problem. However, the digital evidence showed that Marcus's computer had been completely inactive that weekend, while Sarah's laptop showed intensive editing work on exactly the scene Marcus had claimed to rewrite. Judge Thornton's questions during this testimony suggested she was beginning to grasp the full scope of the deception. She asked Morrison to clarify whether the digital evidence could definitively prove who had written the manuscripts in question. Morrison's response was unequivocal. Based on document creation patterns, editing histories, and communication records, Sarah appeared to be the actual author of all 8 novels published under Marcus's name. As the day's testimony concluded, Marcus's legal team huddled in urgent consultation. The digital evidence had systematically dismantled every element of his authorship claims, leaving them with few options for maintaining his position. The forensic analysis had provided an objective, technical foundation for questioning everything Marcus had built his career upon, and the implications extended far beyond the courtroom into the heart of the literary world itself. The third day of testimony opened with Patricia Vance calling Amanda Torres, Marcus's lead editor at Hartwell Literary Press, to the witness stand. Torres had worked directly on 4 of Marcus's novels over the past 5 years, and her professional relationship with the supposed author would prove to be far different from what the literary world had assumed. Torres appeared uncomfortable as she was sworn in, glancing nervously toward Robert Chun in the gallery before taking her seat. Her testimony began routinely enough, with Patricia establishing her credentials and experience in developmental editing. Torres described her role in shaping narratives, working with authors to strengthen character development, and ensuring thematic consistency across complex manuscripts. When Patricia asked Torres to describe her typical working relationship with Marcus Reed, the editor's discomfort became more pronounced. Torres explained that all her substantive editorial conversations had been conducted with Sarah not Marcus. Initially, she had assumed this arrangement reflected Marcus's preference for having his wife handle business communications. However, over time, Torres realized that Sarah demonstrated an intimate understanding of every aspect of the manuscripts that suggested something far beyond administrative involvement. Torres recalled specific instances where she had raised complex editorial concerns about character motivations or plot inconsistencies. Sarah had consistently provided sophisticated solutions that required deep knowledge of the narrative structure and thematic intentions. When Torres asked follow-up questions about these creative decisions, Sarah answered with the confidence and insight of someone who had personally crafted every element being discussed. The most revealing portion of Torres's testimony came when Patricia asked her to describe a particular editing session for Marcus's seventh novel. The manuscript had contained a subplot that felt disconnected from the main narrative, and Torres had scheduled a conference call to discuss potential revisions. Marcus had been present for the call, but when Torres raised specific concerns about character consistency and thematic integration, he had repeatedly deferred to Sarah for explanations. Torres testified that Sarah had provided a detailed analysis of how the subplot connected to the larger themes of identity and redemption that ran throughout the novel. She had suggested specific scenes to strengthen these connections and proposed dialogue revisions that would better serve the overall narrative arc. Marcus had remained largely silent during this discussion, occasionally nodding agreement but offering no creative input of his own. Following Torres, Patricia called James Mitchell, Marcus's literary agent for the past 6 years. Mitchell's testimony provided another perspective on the behind-the-scenes reality of Marcus's supposed creative process. Like the editor, Mitchell revealed that all his substantive conversations about manuscripts, plot development, and creative direction had been conducted with Sarah rather than Marcus. Mitchell described Sarah as exceptionally knowledgeable about market trends and reader preferences. She had consistently demonstrated an understanding of how to position Marcus's work within the competitive literary landscape, suggesting strategic approaches to character development and thematic elements that would appeal to both critics and commercial audiences. Mitchell had found these conversations remarkably insightful, noting that Sarah seemed to possess an intuitive grasp of storytelling that surpassed many of his other clients. The agent's testimony became particularly damaging when Patricia asked him about contract negotiations and rights discussions. Mitchell revealed that Sarah had been the one to negotiate foreign translation rights, subsidiary licensing agreements, and film option contracts. She had demonstrated detailed knowledge of intellectual property law and had insisted on specific language protecting the integrity of the narrative voice across different media adaptations. Patricia next introduced testimony from Elena Rodriguez, a freelance copy editor who had worked on 3 of Marcus's novels. Rodriguez brought with her a manila folder containing original manuscript pages covered in handwritten editorial notes. When Patricia asked Rodriguez to identify the handwriting on these documents, the copy editor's response sent visible shockwaves through Marcus's legal team. Rodriguez testified that all the handwritten notes, revisions, and editorial comments had been made in Sarah's distinctive script. The pages contained detailed character analysis, plot structure diagrams, and thematic annotations that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of every aspect of the creative work. Rodriguez had worked directly with Sarah throughout the editing process, receiving revised passages and creative solutions that addressed every editorial concern with remarkable precision. The handwriting evidence proved particularly compelling because it showed Sarah's direct involvement in the most creative aspects of manuscript development. The annotations weren't administrative notes or simple corrections. Instead, they revealed someone thinking through complex narrative problems and developing innovative solutions that strengthened the overall impact of each novel. Patricia's next witness was Dr. Michael Chun, a literature professor at Yale University who had assigned Marcus's novels in his contemporary fiction courses. Chun had invited Marcus to speak at a literary symposium 2 years earlier, but the actual presentation had been delivered jointly by Marcus and Sarah. Chun testified that while Marcus had provided biographical information and general comments about his career, Sarah had handled all the technical questions about narrative technique and thematic development. Dr. Chun recalled that Sarah had demonstrated remarkable expertise in analyzing the relationship between character psychology and plot progression. She had fielded complex questions from graduate students about literary influences and stylistic choices with the authority of someone intimately familiar with every creative decision. Marcus, by contrast, had offered only vague generalities when asked about specific aspects of his writing process. The testimony continued with Maria Santos, who handled foreign rights sales for Hartwell Literary Press. Santos revealed that all negotiations for international publication rights had been conducted through Sarah, who had demonstrated surprising fluency in discussing translation challenges and cultural adaptation issues. Sarah had insisted on specific contractual language protecting the narrative voice and had provided detailed guidance to foreign publishers about maintaining thematic consistency across different languages. Santos's testimony highlighted Sarah's sophisticated understanding of how her stories would function in different cultural contexts. She had provided extensive notes to translators explaining character relationships and cultural references that might require adaptation for international audiences. This level of detailed guidance suggested someone with profound investment in preserving the integrity of the creative work across multiple markets. Robert Chun was recalled to the stand for additional testimony that would prove devastating to Marcus's remaining credibility. Under Patricia's persistent questioning, Chun admitted that he had never witnessed Marcus demonstrate the kind of intimate knowledge of his own work that publishers typically expected from their authors. Every substantive editorial decision had been made by Sarah, every creative problem had been solved by Sarah, and every marketing strategy had been developed by Sarah. Chin's full admission came when Patricia asked him directly whether he believed Marcus Reed had actually written the novels published under his name. After a long pause that seemed to stretch for minutes, Chin admitted that based on his professional experience working with the supposed author, he had serious doubts about Marcus's role in the creative process. The publisher's statement sent audible gasps through the courtroom gallery and caused Marcus to slump visibly in his chair. The day's final witness was Priya Patel, a book reviewer for the New York Times who had written several prominent reviews of Marcus's work over the years. Patel testified that her initial interviews with Marcus for these reviews had been frustrating because of his inability to discuss his own work with specificity. Subsequent interviews had included Sarah, who had provided the insightful commentary that formed the basis of Patel's published reviews. Patel revealed that Sarah had been the source of all the sophisticated literary analysis that had appeared in major publications under Marcus's name. When reviewers asked about narrative influences or thematic intentions, Sarah had consistently provided thoughtful responses that demonstrated deep understanding of contemporary literary traditions and innovative storytelling techniques. As the day's testimony concluded, Marcus's transformation was complete. The confident author who had begun the week defending his creative legacy now appeared defeated and exposed. The chorus of industry professionals had systematically demolished every aspect of his authorship claims, replacing his narrative of creative genius with evidence of sustained deception spanning nearly a decade. The literary world represented in the courtroom gallery faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Publishers, editors, agents, and reviewers were confronting the possibility that they had collectively participated in crediting the wrong person for years of exceptional creative work. The implications extended far beyond this single case, raising questions about how the industry validates and recognizes literary talent. Judge Margaret Thornton's final ruling came after 2 hours of deliberation that felt like an eternity to everyone present in the packed courtroom. When she returned to the bench, her expression carried the gravity of someone about to deliver a verdict that would reverberate throughout the literary world for years to come. The judge's assessment was methodical and devastating in its precision. She systematically addressed each piece of evidence presented during the week-long proceedings, building an inescapable case that Marcus Reed had perpetrated one of the most elaborate cases of intellectual theft in modern publishing history. Her voice carried sharp disapproval as she described the systematic deception that had fooled editors, publishers, agents, reviewers, and readers for nearly a decade. Judge Thornton noted that the digital forensics evidence alone would have been sufficient to establish Sarah's authorship, but the testimony from publishing professionals had transformed a technical case into something far more profound. The court had heard from editors who had worked directly with Sarah on creative decisions, agents who had negotiated contracts based on Sarah's strategic insights, and reviewers who had praised Marcus for analysis that Sarah had actually provided. The judge's criticism of Marcus was scathing in its directness. She described his behavior as representing not merely marital deception, but professional fraud that had damaged the integrity of the literary publishing process. Marcus had accepted awards, given interviews, and built a career on work he had not created, while simultaneously diminishing the actual author through systematic emotional and professional abuse. The financial ruling awarded Sarah complete ownership of all existing copyrights, future royalties, and derivative rights for the 8 novels published under Marcus's name. Additionally, the court granted Sarah full ownership of the family home, Marcus's study with all its awards and literary memorabilia, and complete control over all publishing relationships and contracts. Marcus was ordered to pay substantial attorney fees and court costs, effectively leaving him financially devastated. However, Judge Thornton's ruling went beyond financial restitution to address the broader implications of the case. She ordered Marcus to publicly acknowledge Sarah's authorship through written statements to be distributed to all major publishing industry publications. The court also mandated that all future editions of the novels include proper attribution to Sarah as the actual author, with Marcus's role limited to that of a collaborator who had provided minimal contributions. The immediate aftermath of the ruling created chaos in the courtroom. Literary journalists rushed to file stories that would fundamentally reshape the understanding of one of contemporary literature's most celebrated careers. Robert Chin sat in stunned silence as he contemplated the implications for Hartwell Literary Press and the industry credibility crisis that would inevitably follow. Marcus's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and desperate defiance. He attempted to argue with Judge Thornton's ruling, insisting that the court had misunderstood the collaborative nature of creative partnerships. His protests were quickly silenced by his attorney, who recognized that further statements would only compound the damage. Marcus left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the media crowd that had gathered to witness the conclusion of what entertainment reporters were already calling the literary scandal of the decade. Sarah's emergence from the courthouse marked a profound transformation that extended far beyond the legal victory she had just achieved. For the first time in nearly a decade, she stood in public as the acknowledged author of work that had garnered critical acclaim and commercial success. The woman who had hidden her manuscripts in locked drawers now faced a crowd of journalists eager to hear from the true creative voice behind 8 best-selling novels. Her first public statement as the recognized author was delivered with quiet dignity that impressed even the most cynical observers. Sarah acknowledged the personal cost of the lengthy legal battle while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to finally receive credit for her creative work. She spoke about the importance of recognizing all contributors to artistic endeavors and the need for the publishing industry to examine how it validates and acknowledges creative partnerships. The publishing world's response was swift and comprehensive. Hartwell Literary Press issued a public statement acknowledging Sarah Reed as the sole author of all 8 novels previously credited to Marcus. Robert Chin personally apologized for the company's role in perpetuating the misattribution, though he emphasized that Hartwell had been deceived along with the rest of the literary community. Major book retailers quickly updated their systems to reflect Sarah's proper authorship, while online platforms modified their listings to credit the correct author. The process was complicated by the need to maintain continuity for readers who had followed the series under Marcus's name, but the industry consensus supported complete transparency about the true creative origins of the work. Literary award committees faced the unprecedented challenge of determining how to address recognition that had been given to the wrong person. The American Library Association announced a comprehensive review of past awards, while the International Book Critics Circle established a special committee to examine the implications for their own recognition programs. Several organizations ultimately decided to reissue awards directly to Sarah, creating a unique situation where past honors were formally transferred to their rightful recipient. The academic response proved equally transformative. Universities that had assigned Marcus's novels in contemporary literature courses quickly updated their curricula to reflect Sarah's authorship. Professor Michael Chun at Yale announced that his department would use the case as a teaching tool for discussing authorship, intellectual property, and gender dynamics in the publishing industry. Sarah's first interview as the acknowledged author appeared in the New York Times 2 weeks after the court ruling. The lengthy profile explored her background as a literature graduate who had sacrificed her own career ambitions to support what she believed was a shared creative endeavor. The article revealed that Sarah had been writing fiction since college, but had gradually been convinced by Marcus that her role was better suited to supporting his supposedly superior talent. The interview also disclosed that Sarah had been working on an entirely new novel throughout the legal proceedings, written entirely independently and without any input from Marcus. This upcoming work would serve as her first publication under her own name from the beginning of the creative process. Early readers from her new publishing house described the manuscript as her strongest work yet, suggesting that freedom from Marcus's influence had unleashed even greater creative potential. The literary community's embrace of Sarah was remarkably warm and comprehensive. Authors who had previously praised Marcus's work publicly acknowledged Sarah's talent and expressed admiration for her courage in pursuing the difficult legal battle necessary to reclaim her creative identity. Book clubs across the country organized special discussions focusing on the themes of hidden labor and unrecognized contributions that had taken on new significance given the revelation about the novel's true authorship. Marcus's attempted comeback efforts proved futile and increasingly desperate. He tried to position himself as a collaborative partner who had been unfairly demonized by legal proceedings that failed to understand the creative process. However, his interviews were poorly received, with critics noting his continued inability to demonstrate intimate knowledge of the work he claimed to have co-created. Several publishers considered manuscripts that Marcus submitted independently, but the writing quality was so dramatically inferior to the novels attributed to him that any remaining doubts about Sarah's sole authorship were quickly eliminated. Marcus's authentic voice bore no resemblance to the sophisticated literary style that had made the novel successful, confirming that his contributions had indeed been minimal to non-existent. The broader cultural impact of the case extended well beyond the literary world. Women's organizations embraced Sarah's story as an example of the invisible labor that often supports male achievement in creative fields. Academic conferences began examining similar patterns in other artistic disciplines, leading to broader conversations about recognition, credit, and the ways that collaborative relationships can mask systematic exploitation. Sarah's new publishing contract with Beacon Literary represented a fresh start that honored both her past achievements and her future potential. The advance for her upcoming novel exceeded anything Marcus had ever received, reflecting both the commercial success of her previous work and the industry's commitment to supporting her independent career. I'd love to hear from all of you who followed this incredible journey of truth and justice. Have any of you experienced situations where your work or contributions went unrecognized, whether in creative fields or other areas of life? How did Sarah's courage to fight for recognition inspire you to think about your own experiences with hidden labor or unacknowledged contributions? Share your thoughts in the comments about how this story resonated with your own life. The transformation was complete 18 months later when Sarah's first independently published novel, Reclaimed Voices, debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The book explored themes of identity, authenticity, and the courage required to step out from behind someone else's shadow. Critics praised the work as Sarah's most mature and powerful writing, suggesting that her legal victory had freed her to explore creative territories she had previously been unable to access. Meanwhile, Marcus had faded into complete obscurity, his attempts to rebuild his career consistently undermined by the stark contrast between his actual abilities and the sophisticated work he had once claimed as his own. His final public appearance was a poorly attended reading at a small independent bookstore, where he read from a self-published memoir that failed to gain any significant readership or critical attention. The Reed case became a landmark in intellectual property law, frequently cited in legal education programs and professional development courses for publishing industry professionals. Law schools incorporated the case into their curricula, as an example of how traditional contract and copyright frameworks needed to evolve to address the complexities of collaborative creative relationships. Sarah's success continued with subsequent novels that further established her as one of contemporary literature's most important voices. Her work was translated into dozens of languages, adapted for television, and studied in universities around the world. She had not only reclaimed credit for her past achievements, but had proven that her talent extended far beyond what Marcus had ever imagined possible. The literary world had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of looking beyond public personas to understand the true sources of creative achievement. Sarah's courage in pursuing justice had created lasting changes in how the industry approaches questions of authorship and recognition, ensuring that future creators would have better protection against the kind of systematic exploitation she had endured. Justice had not only been served, but had created a foundation for preventing similar abuses in the future. Sarah Reed had emerged from Marcus's shadow to claim her rightful place as one of literature's most compelling voices, proving that truth and talent ultimately prevail over deception and theft.